Welcome everyone to this Methods Hub seminar on research rivers, creative methods, research strategy, and uncertainties in times of crisis. It's my great privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Robert Meckin, who is a presidential fellow at the School of Social Sciences at the University of Manchester. Robert originally trained as a biomedical scientist. He was working on treatments for schizophrenia. For his PhD, he then switched to the field of science and technology studies. So he's someone who's truly interdisciplinary because he's obtained disciplinary training in the biomedical sciences as well as in the social sciences. He's also a member of the National Center for Research Methods, which is a key part of the social science research and methods infrastructure in the UK. Robert is very interested in how interdisciplinary research comes about, despite there being disciplinary methods and boundaries. So he'll be talking to us about his methodological insights into the research process in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and uncertainties in conducting research during this period. So Robert, thank you so much for doing this seminar. Whenever you're ready, please go ahead and start.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Tirani, and thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate that. And yeah, I appreciate that it's a Friday afternoon. I don't know about where you guys are, but in the UK, that's generally a fairly subdued time. So thank you very much for making the effort. Yeah, I'll share my screen in a sec. One thing I was just going to say is if you, as I'm talking for the first 5 or 10 minutes or so, if you have either a pen or paper to hand or some sort of sketching app, that might come in useful in about 5-10 minutes time. So I'm going to share my screen and start my presentation. Right, yeah, so thank you very much. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of background to this project. I suppose I'm talking to you about this project and its kind of history. And so there's different parts of it, and I'm not talking about everything, but I'm just going to give you some of the background into how it came about and what we did in this particular set phases of this particular project. I'm not talking from a script, so I don't know, I think we'll end in about 30 to 40 minutes. I'm not quite sure how long it's going to take. But yeah, that's just sort of some stuff to say. So I'll give you some background. I'll talk about rivers, which is a kind of research rivers, which was a creative method that we used within research in the pandemic. And then the project kind of unfolded and became more and more focused on uncertainties. So the sort of third part is going to focus more on uncertainties. So starting off with some background, I have sort of fairly liberally visited Unsplash, so there's a few images from Unsplash in this presentation related to rivers. So Tirani's already introduced NCRM actually, but in terms of its infrastructural role at the moment, it's focused on research training, and its sort of strapline is that it provides comprehensive research training in social research methods. It's now just over halfway through phase 4. It was initially funded in 2004, and it's been refunded sort of every 5 years or so since then. So next year is its 20th anniversary, and we're planning a whole bunch of sort of celebratory events and so on to do with that. As Tirani said, I have a background in, my undergraduate was in the sciences, and I did some research within biomedical sciences, and then shifted through education and into science and technology studies, and I sort of find myself in and around sociology. I guess because science and technology studies uses social research methods and sociological kind of approaches to understand knowledge production in the sciences. as well as lots of other methods. It's you know, and approaches from philosophy, history, geography, and so on in STS. So in that regard, I mean, some of the things that have influenced me are writers like Bruno Latour and Karen Barad, for rethinking how we imagine the world to be constructed and the things within it, and therefore with the status of knowledge within that. And in line with that, I suppose I'm also have interests. So that's kind of an interest in knowledge production within the natural sciences, as it were, but also interested in how we create knowledge in social sciences, and the relationships between those and people's understandings and of the natural sciences. And through that, I've got an interest in creative and sensory methods, which sort of emerged during some research on public anticipation of biotechnologies. So a lot of my research, having some expertise in the biomedical sciences, or some history in the biomedical sciences, not expertise, is it meant that I've done some research on biotechnologies and how they've emerged. So that's just a little bit of background to myself. I joined NCRM just at as it was sort of refunded in a transition phase between phase 3 and phase 4. So that was around the end of 2019 and the start of 2020. So almost straight away in my role there, and as many of us know, the pandemic sort of emerged and started to become the thing that it was. So just to take us back to 3 years ago, the sort of UK lockdown started on the 24th of March. And these are just some headlines, just so that, you know, just to sort of recreate some of that worry, concern, and confusion and outrage and all sorts of other emotions that happened at that time. The picture on the left-hand side is taken from a Guardian composite, where they've sort of, I guess, positioned their own left-leaning stance in it against some of the more conservative press. So the Times, Telegraph, Mail, and so on are all perhaps a little more outraged by the imposition on people's freedoms. The Financial Times, I guess, gives a slightly more neutral view, but there's obviously around economics, and it was the idea that Britain was closed, I suppose. The whole point being that this time had a huge impact on social research and how researchers were going to go about continuing to research within their projects, and that had consequences both for the things that I was intending to do for NCRM, but also for lots and lots of other researchers who are researching various things in this at that time, and whose projects were at all kinds of different phases and stages. And I think it's also worth pointing out that it's not just academic research, but the social research is done by all kinds of institutions, charity sector, government, and so on, all require social research methods. So after that initial first couple of months of kind of concern and worries and all of that, I mean, this is, partly personal circumstances as well, but we at NCRM were having discussions around how we might respond to COVID-19, and we spoke to the funder, who is the Economic and Social Research Council, and as part of the broader UK response to research response to COVID, we were given some additional funds for a research associate. And so with myself, Professor Melanie Nind, and Dr. Andy Coverdale, we started this project that was asking the question, at least initially, how have social research methods been successfully adapted or designed for use within pandemic conditions? So that was kind of the starting point, and we felt that the role of NCRM was to both try and find a way through lots of literature that was starting to emerge, both sort of in more informal discussions online and blogs and so on, but also literature was emerging, but also to engage researchers who were actively researching or having issues with their research and so on, in a series of workshops. So the aims of the projects in line with that were to engage the research community, both within and beyond the academy, in learning together and sharing methodological responses to and the experiences of COVID-19 when conducting social research, and to synthesize the evidence on how things had been successfully adapted or theoretically thought through that might work within pandemic conditions. And I should say that when I kind of shorthand refer to COVID-19, I'm really talking about the kind of social restrictions and the ways that it was articulated within this kind of socio-political environment. So rather than it being, I'm not referring to COVID-19 as a kind of just a biological viral entity, but more as a kind of hybrid thing that cut across all kinds of different domains. So yeah, the project kind of had two main strands then in line with those aims. One was to review the published evidence, and Andy was sort of led that stream of work, or was instrumental in that stream of work, looking at the rapid evidence review and the grey literature review. And then I took more of a lead on the engagement side, in which we were sharing experiences and resources with one another. And those two things together, we produced different reports and resources and so on. So as initially I think we had 9 months from August 2020, but we then had a 3-month extension and then another 6 or 9 months, I can't quite remember, of the research. So it kind of had these different phases and extensions, as we felt that we hadn't either picked up certain areas of methodology, or that and there's certain things that needed to be explored further, and later that we sort of focused increasingly on uncertainty, as I've mentioned already. So if you go to the web page, it kind of looks like this, the National Centre for Research Methods, and the project was called Changing Research Practices. And yeah, you can see the different tiles and so on. And particularly during the first couple of phases, we produced quite a lot of quick wayfinder guides, they were called. So just sort of inspiration documents for people that were having difficulty with particular methods or methodological areas. And it was just a kind of quick signposting to those. Also, and under here, if you were to scroll down, it's just a screenshot, but if you scroll down, there's sort of various reading lists that relate to these as well. And those were compiled through the workshops and through the literature review. So they're kind of an output, a co-produced output. So that was the stuff that was emerging as we were doing the project. And then we produced a range of reports, and I guess I know it's probably coming across like, oh, we did, you know, the reason I'm saying this is so that there are resources that you could go to find out more about what I'm saying if you're interested, and where some of what I'm saying comes from, perhaps in more detail, more references and so on. So there's initial reports from phase 1, which was undertaking social research in the context of COVID-19. We produced the rapid evidence review specifically, and then that was updated for bringing in the 2021 literature as well. And then we have some publications that have come out, or this main publication at the moment, which is part of a special issue in the International Journal of Social Research Methodology. But just to sort of flag those up as different places that you can go for additional information if you want. Okay, so rivers is the next phase, or the next part of this talk. So I've sort of given the background of and why the project was structured the way it was, and the aims to do that. And so research rivers was a way that we wanted to, well, initially talk to, have researchers think through some of their issues and just introduce themselves to one another. So for the first workshop we invited research to represent their research as a river sketch as sort of preparation. This bit stayed the same, but we imagined that people would maybe take, 3 minutes or something to introduce themselves. And what we found in our debrief from the first workshop was that it took the best part of an hour for 6 people to talk through their projects. And so we realized that this was like a key way for people to express and explore their research experiences. In terms of the workshop structure, again, we'd sort of said, we've got an hour and a half of substantive online research, and we were using Zoom for it. But you can stay for an additional 1 hour after a break if you so wish. Like, that was kind of the option that we gave to researchers. We assumed that the assumption was that people were really busy and that they might not be able to make time. Lots of people were still at home, dealing with working at home for this, in this first period. So that was so our idea was to do some of this work when people had a bit of chance, maybe 10 or 15 minutes before the meeting at some point, and then they could come to the workshop, discuss, and then leave after an hour and a half or 2.5 hours, depending on what was suited for them. So that's the kind of the rationale for the structure. And then as that emerged, it just became people would do more or less preparation in terms of the research rivers, but would typically stay for the whole 2.5 hours. And, clearly it seemed to be really beneficial for people. Anyway, so that's just a bit about the structure. And so we sort of suggested that people use different elements of rivers. So they could use, just for some examples, meanders, waterfalls, eddies, shoals, or whirlpools to indicate different kinds of issues of their research career. So like over the last year or year and a half was the kind of time frame that we got. So we're trying to get what was just before COVID, how things were going, what happened to people's research during COVID and the lockdowns, and then where were they up to and what had happened to them. And it was just, just as I've sort of intimated, just generally found it to be quite useful. And lots of people annotated, and I've got some more images to show you. I've just shown this as one, and the sort of the range went from people, realizing that other people had prepared and doing like a quick sketch, pencil sketch on a piece of paper, all the way through to people clearly putting in quite a lot of time and preparing, thinking it was a worthwhile thing for them to do, regardless of the workshops, as it were. It seemed to be something that was kind of useful for people. So with that in mind, here's just another example. This one, just a biro drawing, but with lots of whirlpools and timelines and all of this kind of stuff, which I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail. So because I think it's kind of useful, and it's also good to perhaps have a break and be a bit active on a Friday afternoon. If you do yourself a river now, so think about the last year or maybe up to 3 years of a research project or your own research biography, and sketch out a sort of river history of it. So, start where you want. Rivers have all kinds of different aspects. And I think if we do this for I'm going to say about 7 minutes or so, I'm going to draw one myself. I've got a little pencil and notebook here. So, because I haven't done this for a little while, and I'm kind of interested in just reflecting on where I'm up to, and it's a good opportunity. So yeah, for the next sort of, I'm going to say 7 or so minutes, if you want to sketch out a river, what I imagine is that probably won't talk about them immediately, but it's something that might be a resource to talk about stuff in the question and answers after I've finished talking. So that's kind of why I'm thinking it might be useful to do as well. And it's also something you could add to as I continue to talk. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a sec, and we can, or at least, maybe that's not going to work. I'll leave that up. In at past, we can come back and I'll continue to talk. Right, I hope you're all enjoying that. I've got a fairly rudimentary looking river, but with quite a lot of annotations at the moment. But it does, yeah, it's just helpful, I think, for me to visualize some of the things where things are up to and where they've come from. So anyway, feel free to keep annotating or drawing if that's useful. Obviously, if you know, if you're want to, yeah. So I'm going to speak for, I think, around another 20 minutes or so, sort of thinking about the rivers and then thinking about uncertainties. So I guess part of the logic of doing these rivers was based on the Rivers of Life method, which is kind of a life history method. It was by the STEP Centre, which is a centre for sustainability at the University of Essex. Sussex, sorry, not Essex, Sussex. But it also speaks to kind of creative and arts-based methods and why being able to express and represent things not necessarily just verbally is useful, and that bringing a metaphor like rivers to something else can kind of change how you make sense of it. I think because we're talking about kind of the biography of a project and therefore some kind of object or practices and so on, it seems to me to not just be about somebody's biography, which is what the Rivers of Life exercise was about, but it is also about kind of you know, non-human or telling the stories of other things as well, the biographies of other things. And the reason, yeah, so what was I going to say on that? Yes, one of the reasons that the STEP Centre used rivers in the first place was because they're a relatively well recognized and sort of culturally recognized entity, and so lots of people can make sense of them in an extended metaphor kind of way. The reason I've got the image on the right there is just because this one is unusual. A lot of the images, and you'll see in a bit, and a couple from that I've already shown, the rivers will typically be drawn as a plan, so a bird's eye view over the top, moving from left to right across the page, with a kind of some times on there, and some other stuff. This one is quite different from that. It has a found cartoon that the person sort of used and as referenced on the photograph there, and then they've annotated it themselves and drawn on top of it as well. So it's a very, very different kind of thing, and I just like it because it's yeah, it was unusual in the kind of cohort of 35 rivers that we ended up having. I think we had 56 researchers attend all the workshops and got 35 images. Yeah, so you can see that there's a dam in the way. This person couldn't get access. They had problems getting access to data, and then there's a whirlpool, and then off towards the mountains in the background. But they're also swimming upstream, and a lot of people traveled downstream with the rivers. So it's just an unusual one that I like. And it just shows the variability of representation, I think. So this was a different one. This was from one of the first workshops. In fact, it was from the first workshop initially, although this particular researcher came back with another version of this in which they'd annotated added some additional detail to. But you can see the way that it kind of has these this kind of a river with a confluence is the technical term when a tributary joins a river. So we've got sort of four main things here. There's the kind of whirlpool-y thing for the March 2020 lockdown, a copse of trees, the confluence, and then a waterfall, which shows a change of pace. And so, yeah, when we were thinking about how researchers were presenting their work, we also didn't think it was right just to have the images stand alone, and so we thought through them as image accounts, so both what the image was, but also how the researcher talked about the image within the workshop. And so this particular researcher, which is a pseudonym, by the way, said, I've kept a lot of my perhaps personal experience out of the pandemic personally, out of the picture. And the only reason I can think of why I did that is because I've just come back from annual leave, and I probably feel a lot more like in my head that things have separated a little bit better. So before I went on annual leave, all these things were very, very blurred and the boundaries were blurred. And I think if I'd done this map before, you'd probably have seen a whole lot more whirlpools. And so they kind of like, you know, there's a reflexivity and comparison with other images within the workshop as well, which is why it doesn't really make sense just to kind of take the image and analyze it as its own thing. And it also wasn't really what we were interested in doing. We were interested in how people talked about and spoke about their experiences. And so this just shows that comparison. I think they were one of the last to present in the first workshop, so they had a few other examples. And they also talk about doing it on the computer as opposed to lots of the others, which were sort of pen and pencil drawings. So that's why we're kind of like analyzing them as an image account. And then secondly, oh, sorry, I don't know why that's gone a bit low quality. But anyway, a different river. This was done by a fairly experienced researcher in a workshop that was on creative methods and how people were adapting creative methods to the pandemic. And they really, you know, got clearly quite engaged, got out their felt tip pens and drew a river with the kind of March 2020 as the fallen tree across the river, and there's a kind of storm or lightning in above the tree, or perhaps hitting the tree or whatever. In the river are fish, and the fish represent people. So on the left hand side is the team, the research team, which are fish, and then further down river, further downstream are participant fish in a slightly different color. And also there are sort of canals, and the black annotations, which look like sort of like detonators to me, but are shovels, showing the additional work that it took to dig or to create different channels for research to go down. Okay. And then so the project's the research was done around where the or this was created around where the year 2 line is, where that kind of wiggly line is, and everything to the right hand side of that wiggly orange line is the future. So there's kind of like more work to do in the future. Perhaps the whole project is going to come together. And the researcher also talked about how there was hope and stuff in and future possibilities after COVID had passed and we returned, or things opened up again. Well, return's not the right word. And just one last point is the kind of pool at the bottom right hand corner where it says TBC. I'm going to make a point about that, but that's a method that's where the research had done lots of initial work around doing a particular method, but it couldn't carry on in the vein that it was planned. And so the first thing that this researcher said, so this is workshop 5 of that first phase, and you can see the terrifying mess on the screen. So I just remember that it's quite funny, I guess. And then they explain that the shovel activity is about trying to liberate the water in the research project so that they could interview. They planned to do research with particular kinds of participant groups, but they found that they would only be able to, they couldn't, and those were parents, staff, and students, I think. But they couldn't do some of them. They could no longer engage with students in the way that they'd wanted because the students weren't engaging with another provision, and so they had to focus on staff in the first instance. And they did have to go and get ethical approval, because it was shifting to online and they hadn't planned to do that. So they needed to adjust their informed consent, and then they created videos to make the informed consent process more accessible, engaging, and so on. So yeah, the ways that people related to participants and co-researchers changed through the pandemic. So what these two examples give us are kind of three different routes for the fates of methods and projects. One is around routine adaptation, which is the kind of moving interviews online for professional groups in particular, finding replacement participants and minor amendments to research ethics proposals, things that are done as part of quite, a reasonable number of research projects, or perhaps as part of research anyway, and maybe wasn't substantial. It might introduce some errors and challenges, but it's not as extensive or problematic as non-routine adaptation, where people were having to revisit the theoretical frameworks, create new participant groups, rebuild their methods entirely. And so the stakes for non-routine adaptation are quite a lot higher, and there's a sort of risk of failure in that. And then there are dormant methods. So this speaks to that pool at the bottom right-hand side. And in the project, what had been intended was they'd spent some time developing a game that was to be used as a research method for students. I think it was students to explore, or for participants to explore their identities within this particular kind of game. There's been quite a lot of effort to create these material games. But they... because of the pandemic and that, it wasn't possible to convert this to an online thing, it was put in a cupboard, and I think there were three or four versions of this game, 3 or 4 copies of it that were put in a cupboard and just lived there. So they had the hope of using this in the future, but they weren't being used. And Sophie Woodward has come up with the idea of dormant things, which is the stuff that we have in and around your home or spaces that we keep hold of in case they have some utility, but also they do something else, something relational. And it's the medium through which people construct their selfhood and biography and their relationships to others and wider worlds. And there seems to be part of that within this methods thing. So it's a dormant method within a researcher's closet that they hope that would be able to be revived, but would it ever become relevant again? They would likely hold on to it. But other examples of that kind of object are things like computer cables that from 20 years ago that people still have in their third drawer down, or some key that you're not quite sure what it belongs to that's in some little box somewhere. But those things that we hold on to. So that's some of the fates of methods. And then in terms of, so that's a kind of empirical stuff, and then reflecting upon what this method does itself. So using the research rivers, they're good at emphasizing agency, it seems. So you can, as people look back, they can see where they've made decisions and where they weren't able to make decisions, how things were affecting their decision making at certain times. They're very good at emphasizing affects. This was something that was a bit of a surprise to us. Lots of the accounts, the image accounts that we had all kinds of sort of anxiety and hope and worries, frustrations, lots and lots of different kinds of affect and emotion that were within these accounts. Obviously, because we're asking to represent time, they are very good at representing temporality. And researchers can talk about the past, present, and future, and how things moved at different paces at different times. And finally, they objectify methods. They kind of do a separation between researchers and the methods, and broadly, that methods are something that we can researchers can work on and align and make more or less suitable to a particular context. So yes, so they emphasize time, continuity, and singularity. You know, typically the rivers are single and they are continuous. You can see that there is something that starts and ends, and it's all part of a single stream of some form. So they're less well attuned to, I would, from thinking about this, less well attuned to place. So if you're thinking about what you might want to do with it, I'm not saying that they can't be used to do place, but you have to think about how you elicit ideas about place in using them. They're not so good at doing discontinuity, it seems, aside from having a sort of dam or something in the river. And they don't seem to be as good at doing multiplicity, and perhaps more thought needs to go into how that might work if that was something that you were interested in eliciting. So there's just some other reflections on doing the research rivers. And so now I'm going to talk about uncertainty. So this is the third part of the presentation, which is kind of where the project, as I've said, started to travel in its own right. So phase 3 of the project was specifically focused on doing workshops. Instead of having different researchers at each workshop, although people did come to different workshops in the other 2 phases, this was intended to be a cohort of researchers who were going to talk about uncertainties in their experiences for longer workshops of 4 hours or half-day workshops, 3 of those. And so I think we had about 10 researchers who engaged, and then at the last workshop, 5 of them made a film, which we're sort of going to get up online soon with some other resources around all of this. What was quite funny is that we didn't ask them to do rivers as part of it, but one of the researchers who hadn't been involved in earlier parts of the project suggested that they draw a river or draw something in order to represent their experiences. So in a sort of strange synchronicity thing, they talk to rivers within this film. It's about 40 minutes. And what it is a very, very articulate but quite dense discussion of all kinds of different kinds of methodological uncertainties that crop up. Yes, these are stills from that film. So what that sort of highlighted, but also and also took us back to some of the earlier work, was that in crisis there is panic, and that is something that is, that's part of it, and to try and recognize that. But there are options. One of the things that in terms of pressures that make it difficult are this idea that researchers should be productive and to continue researching through crisis. We've got to keep being productive, making sure that we're communicating and all of this kind of stuff. That research continues to be rigorous and ethical, and also that it meets its various obligations to funders, various participant groups, and so on. So those are the kind of pressures that can make it, that can enhance or sort of intensify crisis. And so some of the options that there are if you find yourself in the future in a kind of situation where something's gone wrong in a project, you don't have to react immediately, and there's at least a set of things, and there's more than this. This is just stuff that I was able to pull out from the film. But you can react, you can just carry on and work very quickly and try and respond to whatever the emerging set of things are. You can slow down and try and take things deliberately more slowly. You can pause and stop or abandon entirely a project, and that, you know, by abandon it's sort of like returning the funds to the funder and so on. And then following some version of this, you might resume, reprioritize or reorientate the strategy and the project, and think about new collaboration, stakeholders and participants and so on. So there are different approaches, and I'm going to sort of give some more specifics to some of these in a little bit as we go on. So yeah, I'm going to just talk around, I guess, 4 themes. These are my kind of closing themes to this presentation, which sort of highlight different aspects of methodology and what people have thought about them and where they're up to. And some of this is coming from the contributors to the special issue from International Journal of Social Research Methodology. So these are available at the moment. So one of the things that arose is around whose uncertainties are being attended to in the pandemic, methodological debates, and why. And this is a group of researchers who work with people with learning disabilities, and already there was a sense that there was a systematic exclusion for people with learning disabilities, and that uncertainties were extended for and made more difficult for this group. But in their reflection on their kind of projects with through the pandemic, the authors point out that the pandemic unexpectedly created spaces where participants were able to surprise staff, family members, and trust with their responses to these new uncertainties. And you know, they're sort of calling for greater trust and with working with people for whom the uncertainties were significantly extended and intensified around, say, lockdowns for certain groups of people. Like how would they continue to get their food? Were they able to go out when some of the other restrictions have been lifted for other members of society, and so on? And another aspect within making research ethical was around international collaborations and the ways that researchers in well-funded environments, often in the global north, aren't fully aware of the uncertainties. And this is where uncertainty starts to become a sort of broader concept. So it's where the pandemic has heightened awareness of uncertainties for some people, but there are all kinds of other uncertainties that are distributed across the globe. And so some researchers might have financial, health, and safety concerns, and are disproportionately given those uncertainties in the ways that research relationships are set up. So both Dunya's article and York's article discuss the ways that they were reflexive or created collaborations to try to be aware and mitigate those distributions. Making research valid and trustworthy is a serious concern in crisis. And while for the ways that some qualitative research is orientated deliberately to uncertainty, I'll mention this in a sec, but survey research tried to use different methods to increase or to maintain validity of their research, which includes using the same interviewers across modes to mitigate mode effects. So where research had questionnaires perhaps had been administered in person and had then gone online, or were swapping between those two. So that was one way that to maintain or attend to validity, but also to use experiments and subsamples and secondary populations to compare and test out the ways that the pandemic had affected the cohorts that were in different surveys. Sort of an ongoing thing is in response to the pandemic and other crises such as war in Ukraine or Ethiopia, is around making research sustainable. So the continued review and reflection on the ways that methods are being changed. The financial situations, obviously, it's in the UK at least, we're currently in a cost of living crisis, and there's lots of difficulties around both participants' situations and the research situation. And one of the points is around choice within engagement with projects, and that to offer choice to participants and how they engage with different projects, and a wide attendance to well-being, and that's both participants but also researchers and not lots, but members of our participant groups, or the people that engage with our project, talked about not realizing the importance for their own well-being or enough of the research team that they've been part of. And so that's a very interesting point around reflexivity and awareness of the research context. And then we also talked around thinking around what kinds of methods were sustainable in the sense that they've matured quickly. So online interviews and focus groups seems to be a proliferation and maturity around how advanced these are in terms of how people can do them, and the impacts, the ethical thoughts around them. So, like, for instance, doing an interview online, you can often be in somebody's home, and is that that boundary and that moving the public and private spaces, all that sort of thought has been done quite extensively. At the same time, there are emerging sort of research approaches that still require more development in how they work in crisis. So community-based participatory research, and using, say, walking interviews with remotely with somebody connected to a mobile phone is another possibility. But these are sort of more thoughts around how things that might need developing further, or more thought going into their effects. So the final thing I'd like to talk about, which is kind of to end on a positive note, as it were, which is around making research happen. This was another theme that we kind of identified, and I'm just going to draw on one very specific example because it's I just think it's a very interesting one. So Carrie Jewett and her team at the Institute of Education at UCL were researching digital touch. And so what happens when you're researching digital touch and you're halfway through a project and contact is prohibited? So they were doing creative and sensory and speculative methods across a range of different projects. And they argue that there is already a discourse, I've kind of alluded to this before, but there's already a discourse of orientation of qualitative methods to uncertainty. This is, the idea of lively methods, that they should be able to deal with things that were unexpected. And so I'm just going to mention a couple of the ways that they articulated and aligned their projects. So cultural probes are a way of, were a kind of method for creating a pack for participants with some instructions. You might send them a camera or some other activities that participants would engage with, and send that by post, and then the participants would return that. They decided that in order to do cultural probes, they would move this online, and instead of curating the materials themselves, as in the researchers, they would ask participants to do that. And they found all kinds of different ways to engage and elicit information from participants using sort of social media and other technologies. And so are able to give power and agency to their participants in ways that perhaps they hadn't thought would be possible using the method of cultural probes in the first place. And secondly, is around sensory ethnography. So one of the researchers was in industry, going to factories and laboratories to understand how sort of digital touch was being, or touch was being used in these different contexts. Obviously, they weren't able to do that, so then they moved their sensory ethnography online and find different ways of being with, so reflecting with participants, even though they're remote and connected only through they're not physically co-present. And partly this was to do with demonstrating different objects, and so that would be like having the same object and being able to talk about them at the same time, and disrupting touch online, which was around trying to sort of show how these particular technologies and so on weren't working, and trying to break them, see what happens. But it's just different ways of approaching the problem of touch when you can't have contact with people, and what that starts to tell you about the phenomenon that you're interested in. So in conclusion, I've talked about some creative approaches to reflecting on and thinking about experiences and methodological experiences in crisis. That there's a range of responses, and it's not, one doesn't have to rush and worry necessarily, and that there is also lots and lots of resources for ongoing uncertainty in the post-pandemic research. So I hope that's been useful, and I'm happy to take any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and yeah, you might need a minute or two to think, but I'll stop share.
Great, thank you so much, Rob. That was a really interesting presentation. So for people who would like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand either on Zoom or on camera, or you can also type in your question in the chat box. So we have some time for questions. So while you're thinking of that, I'll just ask Rob a preliminary question about the digital, if you can tell us some more examples of the digital ethnographic methods that you alluded to, because I think here there were some really interesting innovation in research methods, in ethnographic research methods, by moving online. So, you know, one, you mentioned the walking interviews and the done on mobile phones, and I was wondering, were most of these sort of digital ethnographic methods, were they synchronous, you know, or could they also be asynchronous? So people record stuff and so on. So yeah, if you could tell us a few more examples of those innovations in digital ethnographic methods, I think that would be some of the methods that some of the audience might be interested in.
Yeah, thanks, Tarani. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I suppose one of the points around cultural probes is that they tend to be asynchronous. So you provide this research pack to your participants, and they go and do some of the activities and so on, and come back and tell you at a later date what happened, using different forms of feedback. So you can interview people, but also a lot of it is through the materials themselves that people produce. And so I suppose when you say ethnographic, I take ethnography itself to be a fairly, pretty broad set of, almost any method can fit within ethnography, I suppose, is the point. So, because it's, it's a kind of framework for doing all kinds of different research. So, so I suppose I think so. One of the things to say about it is not only was there a shift to online, and it was significant, like lots and lots of researchers went online, with obvious issues around exclusion for people who had different distributions of technical skills and or technology itself. And so it's also worth thinking that sort of letter writing is another option that kind of was discussed, and there's a possibility for connecting with people. It's a slower, asynchronous way that people can disrupt this move to being online and researching only online. You can do it by email, but also some people like to write letters by hand and so on. So it's sort of thinking around what's your participant groups and how to best talk to them. So yes, there was, and in that same vein was also telephone interviews. So that telephone interviews had largely not seen a lot of development for a long time, but certain participant groups were really accessible using mobile telephones, and for some groups who were perhaps had less resources, it's possible to kind of pay for their internet connection and or their what's the word, some of their contract funds for their phone in order to engage with the project. So it depends on what the research participant group is with as well. But I think for professional groups and certain and lots of other people, moving online was a really obvious and advantageous way often of making contact with people that that you might not have been able to do anyway if you had to be there physically.
Yeah, I definitely remember sort of the telephone mode of data collection was really important for some of the big longitudinal studies, like the Understanding Society, the UK Household Longitudinal Study, because the initial waves of online data collection sort of missed out a whole group of people that weren't online, and when they did a telephone wave of data collection, they managed to bring in a lot of people who were excluded from the online process. So yeah. Is there anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question? Please don't feel shy. If you
it's also another way into it is to just talk about your own experience of research recently. I've had my own research river, which probably it's not going to focus on it for you because I've got a blur on, but it's a fairly rudimentary thing, but it has helped me sort of see how things are structured in my research career at the moment.
Yes, so if anybody would like to share their research river, I see there's a few things in the chat. I wonder if you would like to share your insights about COVID-19 impact on international research collaboration network. like funding resources, co-authorship, and geopolitical tensions?
Yeah, I suppose I sort of did speak to that a little bit towards the end there. I think it's a significant issue for researchers, particularly in a time when the distribution of funding is the way that it is. So, funds in the global north, researchers, well-funded researchers in the global north, collaborating with researchers for whom the uncertainties aren't limited to COVID and a researcher, a researcher from the north not being able to travel anymore. Researchers in the global north, I'm just using that as a broad category, and from the discussions that have been had through the project, but relied increasingly on researchers in the global south in order to conduct the research on the ground, as it were. So to go out, to know the communities that they were interacting with, to take risk their personal safety, often in zones where there's conflict, or that healthcare isn't so well set up, or is expensive, whatever, all these things, and to try and be aware of and mitigate those. So that's this kind of this issue. So a couple of on the issue of co-authorship, a couple of the examples are co-authored with across these what are termed, I think, contracting researchers and facilitating researchers. So contracting researchers are the researchers who have the funds and initiate, who essentially employ, I guess, other researchers, and facilitating researchers are the ones who are able to conduct the research with their insight, with their local knowledge, and connections and so on. So yeah, that a couple of those in the special issue are co-authored with both groups, with both the contracting and the facilitating researchers. But certainly the crises, I think, are not limited. I think this is why I think it's interesting from a position where I sit, I suppose, and the people that I've spoken to, in that the pandemic was, and probably still is, an ongoing issue for people in their research and their research methods choices and so on. And that's it. It was the one thing that's made a big difference, whereas for lots and lots of other researchers and projects, the pandemic is secondary, or just another thing in amongst all kinds of other, and you mentioned geopolitical tensions, several of the research projects were engaged in various areas of Ethiopia, in which war broke out in 2021. I think it was 2021. And it's got similar surprise, or like in Ukraine, and there's other health crises, there's other things going on for researchers as well. So it's just that the pandemic was particularly for researchers in the global north who hadn't perhaps experienced that kind of thing in the same way for a long time.
Anybody else would like to ask a question, Rob? I won't dare to share my picture of a river, which because of my extremely poor drawing skills. But it was very interesting exercise trying to sketch out the different aspects of my approaches to a particular research problem by using the river as a metaphor. I was trying to sketch out an underground river, but I couldn't visualize that properly on the page.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think as a thing, like, I think we all have a need. a feeling that it should have some artistic merits, but that's not really its kind of function. It's, although some of them are obviously like really good to look at, it's more of just a thought aid, I think. And yeah, I'd like to just say that we're trying to get a way of it being on the NCRM website that you would be able to get some resources, some of the things that I've said, and then go to a sketch app that's kind of embedded within the NCRM pages, so that, you know, and that there might be like a little catalogue of other people's rivers or something from the past. I'm not quite sure how it's all going to work, but we're sort of trying to develop and finalize the legacy resource, as it were, for it all.
So if there's no additional questions, a lot of thank yous in the chat. I'd just like to tell everybody to please have a look at the National Center for Research Methods NCRM website that Rob was mentioning. I think it's www.ncrm.ac.uk. Is that correct, Rob?
I will just put it. Yeah, I think that's. I'm just. This is the front page. This is the landing page.
That's
right. You would.
And there's a huge amount of resources there for doing different kinds of research methods in the social sciences, and especially in the context of COVID, there will be a special resource page that.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Kirani, but yeah, just to say, I mean, there are all kinds of courses and so on, modules and training that NCRM offers. So it's worth having a look at the catalogue to see if it's something that, you know, if there's something in there that's of relevance to you. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Rob, once again. I really appreciate that. I think you know, and lots of people have already sent in comments about how much they really enjoyed your talk. So for those of you who are interested, the Rob's talk, which has been recorded, and the slides will be uploaded to the Methods Hub website in a few weeks or so. So on that note, have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you, Rob, once again.